The crystal chandelier above the Duke of Amberley's head was a waterfall of frozen light, but it did nothing to warm him. He stood near the edge of the grand ballroom of Haverford House, feeling the buzz of 200 voices vibrate through the soles of his polished boots. It was the evening of March 15, 1812, and the air was a thick soup of conflicting smells, the sweet crush of jasmine from the floral arrangements, the tang of beeswax candles, and underneath it all, the faint, damp scent of overheated bodies. In his hand, a porcelain teacup, painted with tiny, perfect forget-me-nots, rattled softly against its saucer. It was a ridiculous, delicate thing. He held it too tightly, his knuckles aching, but the small, trembling chime it made was a complete lie. It suggested nervousness, or excitement. The truth was a cold, hard knot of fury in his stomach. His name was Alistair Thorne, and he hated crowds. He hated the forced laughter, the pointless chatter, the way everyone's eyes seemed to stick to him like burrs. At 32, he had a face that people politely called severe, and a reputation for being sharper than a winter frost. Tonight, however, he had no choice but to be here. This was the social event of the early season, and his presence, or lack of it, would be noted. He took a slow, deliberate sip of the lukewarm tea, letting his gaze travel across the swirling sea of silks and tailored coats. He found her. Lady Eleanor Vance. She was standing by the large French doors that led to the terrace, a shaft of moonlight catching the pale lavender silk of her gown. She was smiling at something Lord Fenton was saying. Fenton, a man with hair the color of wet sand and a laugh that was just a little too loud, leaned in close. Eleanor's smile didn't reach her eyes. Alistair could see that even from here. It was a practiced, polite curve of her lips, a shield. This was her third London season. At 21, she was perilously close to being labelled a spinster. And after the rumors that had begun circulating just this past week, whispers about a compromised walk in the Vance's own gardens, gossip started by none other than Fenton himself, this was likely her last. Alistair's own problems pressed down on him, heavier than any fine wool coat. Just that afternoon, his land steward, a man named Mr. Burton who had served his father, had stood in the Amberley study. The report was grim. The tenant cottages on the northern edge of the estate were crumbling. The roof of the great barn had finally given way after the last snow. And the numbers, written in neat, damning columns in the estate book, showed the Thorne fortune was bleeding away, month by month. "We need a significant investment, Your Grace," Burton had said, his voice grave. "Or next winter will be difficult." The memory was interrupted by another, from this very morning. His grandmother, the Dowager Duchess, had taken her breakfast with him in the sunny morning room. Her hands, thin and lined with blue veins, had poured the chocolate with a steady grace. "The Vance girl's dowry is substantial, Alistair," she'd said, her voice like dry paper. £50,000. Her father made clever investments in shipping. That sum could re-roof every cottage and still leave plenty to shore up the mines. She'd looked at him, her old eyes sharp. "Her reputation is damaged. Your coffers are empty. It is a transaction of mutual need. Some might call it elegant." He had stared at her, appalled. "You suggest I profit from her ruin?" he'd snapped. Her only reply had been a slow blink. "I suggest you secure your legacy." Now, watching Eleanor's solitary figure as Fenton moved away to greet another group, that hairline fracture in Alistair's reality widened into a chasm. The normal world of ballrooms and seasons was a glossy painting, and he was seeing the cracked canvas beneath. His pride said to turn around, to walk out, to find another way. But the sight of the crumbling ledger pages and the imagined sound of a coughing child in a drafty cottage held him still. The orchestra, perched on a gilded balcony, struck up the opening notes of a waltz. The collective energy of the room shifted, a wave of anticipation. It was now or never. A public dance was a statement. For a duke to ask a lady whose reputation was teetering, it would be a lifeline. A questionable one, attached to strings, but a lifeline all the same. He set the forget-me-not teacup down on a passing footman's tray with a final, decisive click. The sound was swallowed by the music. He began to walk. Each step on the polished parquet floor felt like a mile. He kept his eyes on Eleanor, who was now looking down at her gloved hands, seemingly studying the stitching. He saw the careful rise and fall of her shoulders, the way she was consciously holding herself together. He formulated the sentence in his mind. Asterisk, Lady Eleanor, would you do me the honor? Asterisk simple. Direct. It would be a business proposal wrapped in politeness. He was 3 steps away. He could see the fine details of her gown, the tiny seed pearls sewn into the bodice. He could see the tightness at the corner of her mouth. He opened his mouth to speak. And then he heard it. A sharp, collective intake of breath, like a sudden draft had stolen the air from the room. It came from a cluster of matrons standing near the terrace doors, their feathered headdresses quivering. Their eyes were wide, fixed on Lord Fenton, who had turned back toward the room, his voice carrying just a little too clearly over the swell of the violins. He was smiling, that broad, empty smile, and he raised his glass slightly in the direction of where Eleanor stood. A waltz, he said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. Oh, no. I fear my dance card is quite full. And one must be so careful with partners, mustn't one? I certainly won't be claiming that dance. The words weren't shouted, but in the lull between musical phrases, they hit the room like a physical blow. A few people gasped. Others looked away, suddenly fascinated by the ceiling or their own shoes. Eleanor didn't flinch. She went perfectly, terribly still. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking pale as marble in the moonlight. But she did not cry. She did not run. She simply stood there, absorbing the public execution of her social life. And in that moment, Alistair Thorne's path vanished. All the grumpy resistance, the dislike for this silly, cruel world, melted away, replaced by a clear, cold understanding. The offer of a dance was no longer enough. It was too weak, too late. The crack had become a canyon. Fenton hadn't just insulted her, he had thrown the first shovel of dirt on her future. Alistair's own grim future flashed before his eyes, the silent, decaying halls of Amberley, the disappointed faces of his tenants. He closed the final 3 steps. He did not smile. He offered no pretty words. He simply stopped before her, blocking her view of the smirking Fenton. He saw her eyes focus on him, dark pools of shock and humiliation. He gave a stiff, formal bow. When he straightened, he spoke, his voice low but firm, meant for her ears alone, yet carrying just enough to the eager listeners nearby. It was his one line, the dagger meant to cut the tension. Tomorrow, he said, the word short and solid as a stone. At 11. I will call. He didn't ask. He stated. He then offered his arm, not for a dance, but to lead her away from the spotlight. For a heartbeat, she just stared at his proffered elbow as if it were a foreign object. Then, with a dignity that twisted something in his chest, she lifted her chin just a fraction. She placed her gloved hand lightly on his arm. It felt as weightless and fragile as a bird, yet he could feel a faint, furious tremor running through her. He turned, and with the eyes of the entire ballroom burning into his back, he escorted Lady Eleanor Vance, in a silence louder than any music, away from the ruins of her season. The walk to find her mother felt endless. But as they moved, a strange thought settled over Alistair. The die was cast. The course was set. He had stepped into the center of a storm to pull someone out, and in doing so, had anchored himself there, too. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, or what the true cost of this rescue would be. He only knew the old, quiet life was over, and a new, unpredictable story had just begun with a rattling teacup and a few cruel words in a crowded room. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is not walk away from a mess, but step right into it, arm in arm with a stranger, and face whatever comes next, together. The rain had started in the night, a gentle patter that turned into a steady, dreary drumbeat by morning. It was March 17th, 2 days after the Haverford ball, and the sky over London was the colour of old slate. Inside the morning room of the Vance townhouse on Berkeley Square, a weak fire struggled in the hearth, its heat disappearing into the damp air before it could reach the room's occupants. Alistair Thorne, Duke of Amberley, felt the cold through the soles of his boots. It was a different cold than the ballrooms, this was a creeping, quiet chill that seeped into bones. The room smelled of lemon oil, used on the dark wood furniture, and the faint, sad perfume of a vase of lilacs on the mantel, flowers already beginning to brown at the edges. He sat in a stiff-backed chair, facing Eleanor. She was perched on a sage-green settee, looking like a portrait of calm. Her hands were folded in her lap, clad in simple grey wool, not the silks of the ball. But Alistair's eyes, trained by years of noticing the state of fields and livestock, saw the truth. He saw the white-knuckled grip of her fingers, the pulse fluttering in her throat like a trapped sparrow, and the unnatural stillness of her shoulders. She wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on the window, watching the raindrops chase each other down the pane, blurring the world into a watercolor of grey and green. On the small table between them, neatly folded, lay a copy of the Town Crier. The paper was open to the society page. The word seemed to shout even in the quiet room, asterisk, a certain Lady E.V., whose conduct in her family's own gardens has raised more than just flowers, asterisk, it was cruel, clever, and just vague enough to be undeniable. A soft, muffled sob echoed from the hallway. Eleanor's mother, Lady Vance. The sound came at regular intervals, a heartbreaking metronome counting down the final seconds of her daughter's future. Each sob seemed to make the room feel smaller, the air thinner. Alistair cleared his throat. The sound was too loud. He had rehearsed no pretty speech, because there was nothing pretty about this. Lady Eleanor, he began, his voice rough from disuse. You know the situation. Your reputation has been compromised. My estate is facing significant financial difficulty. He laid it out like a butcher weighing meat, direct and unflinching. He spoke of the 47 tenant cottages needing new roofs, the collapsed barn, the drained accounts. He mentioned a sum of £50,000, her dowry, not as a prize, but as a lifeline for lands and people who depended on him. In return, he offered his name, his title, a shield against the gossip. It would be a partnership, he said, the word feeling strange on his tongue. A solution to both our problems. He finished. The proposal hung in the air, bare and clinical. It wasn't a question of love or affection. It was a transaction, written in the cold ink of necessity. Eleanor didn't move for a long moment. The only sounds were the hiss of the damp log on the fire and the distant, rhythmic crying. Then, slowly, she turned her head from the window. She looked not at him, but at the folded newspaper. Her face was pale, but utterly composed. When she spoke, her voice was low, hoarse, and completely clear. It held no tears, only a sharp, clean edge. We save your land, she stated, each word precise. We salvage my name. It wasn't a question. It was a summation. A contract agreed upon. Alistair felt a strange hollow open in his chest. He had expected tears, or anger, or negotiation. He hadn't expected this cool, swift acceptance. He gave a single, slow nod. Yes. A clock on the mantel chimed the quarter hour, the sound tinny and final. The deal was struck not with a handshake, but with that nod and her unblinking stare. He saw her chest rise and fall in a deep, controlled breath, as if she were steadying herself for a long journey. Her shoulders, which had been held so stiffly, squared. A decision had been made, and with it, a strange kind of strength seemed to flow into her. The trembling in her hands stopped. There was nothing more to say. Alistair rose from his chair, the wood groaning in protest. He felt a need to escape the close, sad atmosphere of the room. As he turned to go, his eye caught something on the small table next to the settee, half tucked under a sewing basket. It was another page from the town crier, but a different section. A small notice, only a few lines. It read, "Fire at Oakley Manor." A minor blaze in the library of Lord Fenton's country residence was extinguished by staff early Sunday morning. Cause believed to be a faulty candle. No significant damage reported. Sunday morning. The morning after the ball. The timing was like a sudden, sharp crack of thunder in his mind. The ruin of Eleanor's reputation had been spectacularly fast. The rumors had spread with unnatural speed. And now, a convenient, minor fire at the home of the very man who started those rumors. An accident that caused no real harm, but sent a message. His eyes flicked back to Eleanor. She had seen him notice the clipping. Her gaze met his, and for one fleeting, breathtaking second, the cool mask of the ruined lady vanished. What he saw beneath was not humiliation, or grief. It was a flash of something hot, fierce, and brilliantly calculating. It was the look of a general surveying a battlefield, not a victim licking her wounds. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. Her expression smoothed back into that pale, polite calm. She looked down at her hands again. Alistair stood frozen by the door, the damp chill of the room forgotten. The pieces tumbled in his mind. The ruthless efficiency of her social destruction. This strange, small news item. The fire in her eyes, literally, a fire at Fenton's house. A thought, dark and unexpected, took root. What if this ruin wasn't something that simply happened to her? What if some of it had been allowed? Or even, encouraged? He had walked in here believing he was throwing a rope to a drowning woman. Now, he wasn't sure if she was drowning at all. He might have just agreed to partner with someone who was quietly, expertly, learning to swim through the wreckage, and who knew exactly who had caused the ship to sink. He gave a stiff bow, a formality that now felt absurd, and left the room. As he walked down the hallway, past the closed door where Lady Vance's sobs had finally quieted, his mind was racing. The marriage was set. The path was chosen. But the woman he was going to marry was suddenly a complete mystery. He had thought he was making a simple, grim trade, money for a title. Now he wondered if he had just stepped into a much more complicated game, one where the rules were still hidden, and his new partner held most of the cards. Sometimes, a decision is big when you make it. You feel the weight. But other times, the real size of a choice only hits you later, in a quiet moment, with a single piece of unexpected information. Alistair stepped out into the relentless London rain, but his thoughts were no longer on the weather, or his leaking roofs. They were on the calm, collected woman in the grey dress, and the faint smell of smoke lingering on a news clipping. Their story was supposed to be a simple rescue. But the second chapter had just begun with a shocking truth: sometimes, the person you're trying to save doesn't need saving. Sometimes, they just need an ally. And the most unpredictable journeys begin not with a cry for help, but with a silent, strategic nod across a rainy room. The silence in the Amberley family chapel after midnight was a thing you could feel. It wasn't peaceful, it was heavy, like a thick blanket made of stone and old prayers. A week had passed since the quiet wedding at the Vance townhouse, a simple, swift affair with only family and a few required witnesses. Now, it was April, and a watery moon shone through the tall stained-glass window, casting fractured colors across the empty pews. A saint with a sad blue face watched over the cold floor. Alistair stood at the altar rail, not praying. His hands were braced on the smooth, worn oak, and he stared down at a particular flagstone near his feet. Beneath it lay generations of thorns, including his father. The air smelled of damp stone, melted candle wax from the evening service, and the faint, dry scent of old hymn books. He'd come here because his new wife's presence in the room down the hall, their room, though he used the adjoining dressing chamber, made the entire wing of the house feel too small, too full of unspoken words. He heard the soft click of the chapel door. He didn't turn. He knew the light step. Eleanor entered, still in the simple dark blue dress she'd worn all day. She didn't come to the altar. She chose a pew halfway down, sitting in a pool of red light from the window's depiction of martyrdom. They had become experts in sharing space without touching, in speaking only of necessary things, the weather, the menu, a letter from her mother. Their marriage was a beautifully furnished shell. A grand house full of echoing halls and closed doors. They were like two rare books placed on the same shelf, bound differently, never opened to the same page. During the day, they worked. At Eleanor's firm suggestion, Alistair had shown her the estate books. He'd done it with a sort of grim defiance, expecting her to flinch at the columns of debt. She hadn't. She'd pulled a chair next to his in the library, the scent of her lavender water mixing with the smell of old paper and dust. She'd run a finger down the entries, her brow furrowed. "These numbers for seed purchase," she'd said, her voice quiet. "They're triple last year's market price. And the timber for the barn repair, the supplier listed here went out of business 2 years ago." A cold, different from the chapel's chill, had seeped into Alistair's bones. They had spent the last 3 days cross-referencing ledger after ledger. The rot wasn't just bad luck or poor harvests. It was deliberate. Neat, consistent, and hidden in plain sight. Someone trusted, had been systematically bleeding the Amberley estate dry. The evidence pointed like a compass needle to his steward, Mr. Burton. The man who had taught a young Alistair to fish, who had served his father for 30 years. That was the impossible choice that now haunted the silent chapel. Expose Burton? Have him arrested? It would cause a scandal that would rock the tenant farms. The man knew everything, everyone. It could shatter the fragile trust holding the estate together in its already weakened state. Or, let it continue. Turn a blind eye to the theft, just to keep a fragile, false peace. The thought made bile rise in Alistair's throat. He finally spoke, his voice echoing slightly in the hollow space. "He was at my father's funeral." He cried. It wasn't what he meant to say. From the pew, Eleanor's voice was calm. "Grief and guilt can share the same face." Alistair turned then, leaning back against the rail. In the colored moonlight, he saw his own reflection warped in the dark glass of the window. He didn't see a powerful duke, or a wronged man. He saw a stranger who had been so busy hiding from the world, from the ballrooms, from conversations, from anything difficult, that he had let the worms eat the foundations of his home. His grumpy isolation, which he'd worn like a cloak, wasn't strength. It was neglect. He'd been a caretaker who never left his cottage, while the manor house crumbled. He had married Eleanor as a transaction, and now he saw the same stark calculation in her eyes every day. They were a match, all right. Two people using each other as human shields against their own disasters. "What would you do?" he asked, the question ripped from him. She was silent for so long he thought she might not answer. She looked at her own hands, pale in the crimson light. When she spoke, her words weren't for him, not really. They were for the saint, for the moon, for the silent tombs below. They were her one line, sharp enough to cut through the heavy air. My dowry was never the key. Alistair blinked, confused. What? She stood up then, smooth and silent. She walked toward him, not with a wife's gait, but with a partner's resolve. In her hand, she held one of the smaller ledgers. She stopped before him and opened it to a marked page. She pointed to a series of quarterly payments, listed under legal retainers. A substantial sum, paid to a firm in London. Havisham and Black, Alistair read, his mind foggy with fatigue and despair. Our solicitors. So. Not your solicitors, Eleanor said, her voice low. Their solicitors. Havisham is famous for one thing, managing scandals for the aristocracy. Quietly. Discreetly. For a hefty fee. She took a breath, and for the first time, he saw a crack in her perfect composure. It wasn't fear. It was fury, held in check by sheer will. These payments from your estate began 18 months ago. Right around the time my father first discussed my potential marriage to Lord Fenton with his family. The words hung in the cold air. Alistair's mind, trained on fields and crop yields, struggled to connect the dots. His estate's money, paying a scandal-managing solicitor, around the time of Eleanor's courtship. I didn't understand it at first either, Eleanor continued, her gaze locked on the ledger. I thought Burton was just stealing. But this is too specific. It's a purpose. Why would an estate steward pay a London scandalmonger? She finally looked up at him, and her eyes were clear and hard. Unless he wasn't acting alone. Unless the scandal he was investing in, was mine. The puzzle pieces, sharp and cruel, snapped together. The speed of the gossip. The specific, garden-related detail. The way Fenton had been so brazen, so sure he would face no consequence. It wasn't just malicious gossip. It was a campaign. Funded, in part, by Alistair's own stolen money. Fenton and Burton, Alistair whispered, the truth of physical blow. Cousins, Eleanor confirmed, the word final. I discovered it last week. My mother remembered a distant connection. Burton's mother was a Fenton. It's not widely known. And then Alistair realized the story of her ruin was a lie. Not in the fact of it, the rumors were real, the damage was done, but in its origin. It wasn't a random act of cruelty by a bored lord. It was a targeted, funded demolition. A plan to make her so desperate, her dowry would be the only thing left to sell. And to make him so bankrupt, he'd have to buy it. She hadn't just been a victim of circumstance, swept into his path. She had been placed there, deliberately, by the very men who were stealing from him. The marriage he thought was his last, grim choice had been someone else's strategy all along. He looked at her, truly looked at her, in the multicolored gloom of the chapel. The woman he'd pitied, the woman he'd thought he was saving. He saw the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the tension in her jaw, the absolute lack of surprise. She had known. Or she had suspected. She had walked into this marriage with her eyes wide open, not just to his need, but to the trap surrounding them both. He felt a staggering mix of anger, shame, and a sudden, wild surge of respect. She hadn't come to Amberley to be protected. She had come to investigate. To wage a war. The silence between them changed. It was no longer empty. It was charged, like the air before a summer storm. The impossible choice about Burton was gone, replaced by a clearer, more dangerous path. The enemy had a face. Two faces. Alistair straightened, pushing away from the altar rail. The reflection in the glass shifted. He still saw the man who had neglected his duty, but he also saw, standing beside him, an ally he had never asked for and didn't deserve. He reached out and gently took the ledger from her hands. His fingers brushed against hers, and they were ice-cold. "It seems," he said, his voice new, forged in the cold chapel air, "we have more than just roofs to repair." A ghost of something, not a smile, but an acknowledgement, touched Eleanor's lips. She gave a single, slow nod. They had entered their marriage as a transaction, two shattered pieces trying to prop each other up. But here, in the deepest, darkest point of the night, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, they had found something else. They had found the truth. And sometimes, that's all you need to start building something real. Not a shelter from the storm, but a foundation strong enough to stand and face it, together. The real story of their marriage didn't begin with a ceremony. It began right now, in the quiet, with a shared enemy and a ledger full of lies. And that's often how the best partnerships start, not in the spotlight, but in the shadows, when you finally turn and realize you're not alone in the dark. The Duke's study, once a place of lonely brooding, had been transformed. It was now the heart of a quiet, determined campaign. By mid-April, the room smelled of strong black coffee, sharp ink, and the clean, resiny scent of pine logs crackling in the hearth. Dawn was still an hour away, and the only light came from two glass-shaded lamps and the orange glow of the fire, painting the walls in dancing shadows. Maps of the Amberley estate were spread across the large oak desk, held down by a paperweight shaped like a falcon. Ledgers stood in neat, accusing stacks. In the margins of a planting schedule, in Eleanor's precise handwriting, were notes like, "Burton's brother-in-law," and "Check River toll records for 1810–11. Alistair Thorne leaned over a map, tracing a road with a calloused finger. His old flaw, the grumpy, withdrawn nature that made people avoid him, had become their greatest weapon. No one questioned his long, solitary rides across the estate. Tenants, used to his silent, observant ways, felt comfortable grumbling about Burton's new assistants or the strange fees for market passage. They talked to him because he listened more than he spoke, and he remembered every number. Meanwhile, Eleanor used a different kind of weapon, memory. Seated in a deep leather chair, wrapped in a warm shawl, she pored over society almanacs and old invitation lists. Her knowledge of London's social web was like a master key. "The solicitor, Haversham," she said one evening, not looking up from a gossip column from 2 seasons past. "His wife is obsessed with Italian lace. She buys it from one shop in London, owned by Madame Renard. Madame Renard's daughter, just married the younger brother of Lord Fenton's banker. She would connect dots that seemed miles apart, revealing a hidden network of favors and debts. They worked in a rhythm that needed no explanation. He would bring her a rough fact, a shipment that never arrived, a receipt for 50 pounds of nails when the barn repair used 20. She would find the thread, the connection to a name in the city. They discovered that Burton and Fenton weren't just stealing, they were funneling the money through fake businesses and inflated contracts, preparing to buy the Amberley mining rights for themselves once the Duke was fully bankrupt. It was a pincer movement, ruin Eleanor to make her dowry the only asset, then bankrupt Alistair to force him to take it, only to have the money circle back into their own pockets via the investments. One rainy afternoon, Alistair returned from a ride, his coat dripping, his boots muddy. He placed a small, cloth-wrapped bundle on the desk before Eleanor. "From Mrs. Hobbs, at the South Gate cottage," he said, his voice quiet. Inside was a stack of carefully saved delivery notes, each one signed by Burton for goods that the old woman swore never came. "She said she's kept them for a year, afraid to speak. She thought I wouldn't care." Eleanor looked from the notes to his rain-streaked face. She didn't thank him. Instead, she said, "We have enough." They had decided to confront Burton first. He was the linchpin. Without his ledgers and his access, Fenton's side of the scheme would collapse. They chose a time just after dusk on April 22, when Burton would be finishing his accounts in the small stone steward's cottage at the far edge of the home farm. The walk there was silent. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth and fresh-cut hay. Light spilled from the cottage's small window, a yellow square in the deep blue twilight. Alistair's heart hammered against his ribs, not with fear, but with a fierce, protective anger, for his tenants, for his land, for the woman walking steadily beside him. He knocked. The door opened, and Mr. Burton stood there, his spectacles perched on his nose, surprise turning to a warm, familiar smile that now made Alistair's skin crawl. "Your Grace. Lady Eleanor. To what do I owe the pleasure? Come in, mind the step." The cottage was cozy, tidy, and smelled of stew and pipe tobacco. It was the home of a trusted man. Burton's wife bustled about, offering tea, which they refused. When she left the room, the atmosphere changed. Alistair placed the bundle of Mrs. Hobbs's delivery notes on Burton's tidy desk. Then he placed a ledger, open to the payments for Haversham and Black. "Explain," Alistair said, the single word like a stone dropping. Burton's smile faded. He looked at the papers, then at their faces. He didn't try to deny it. The evidence was too clear. Instead, his shoulders slumped, and his own anger surfaced, a bitter, resentful thing. "Explain," he echoed, his voice losing its warmth. "You left it all to rot. You, hiding in your library, scowling at the world. Your father would have walked these fields every day. He would have known. You didn't want to know. You made it easy." He spat the words, years of secret contempt pouring out. "I kept it all running while you played the hermit. A little compensation for my trouble, it was only fair." Eleanor stepped forward. She didn't raise her voice. Her calm was more terrifying than any shout. "And the rumors about me? The payments to the scandal solicitor? Was that fair compensation, too? Or was that your cousin Fenton's idea?" Burton's eyes widened. The connection they had made, the one he thought was hidden, was laid bare. Panic flashed across his face, quickly replaced by a sneer. "You think you're clever? You're a ruined girl and a failing duke. A marriage of scraps." He leaned on his desk, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You have no proof that links to Fenton. Those payments could be for anything. And without that, it's my word against yours. A steward's poor judgment against the negligence of a duke who can't manage his own estate." He thought he had them. He saw Alistair's isolation, his dislike for public conflict, and counted on it. He saw Eleanor's damaged reputation and counted on that, too. He had mistaken them completely. Eleanor didn't blink. "You mistook a calculated retreat for weakness," she said, her voice colder than the April frost on the window. It was her one line, and it cut the last string of his defiance. At that moment, they heard it, the crunch of gravel under carriage wheels, the whinny of a horse, right outside. Burton's head snapped toward the window, confusion on his face. He wasn't expecting anyone. Alistair was. Earlier that day, Eleanor had penned a letter, in a perfect imitation of Burton's own handwriting, requesting Lord Fenton's urgent consultation on a matter of investment at the cottage at nightfall. Fenton, greedy and unsuspecting, had taken the bait. The cottage door swung open without a knock. Lord Fenton stood there, wrapped in an expensive traveling cloak, a look of impatient expectation on his face. "Burton, what is so urgent that—" His words died as he took in the scene, Alistair and Eleanor standing together, Burton pale and stricken, the damning papers spread across the desk. Fenton's eyes darted from one face to another. He understood in an instant. The trap had been sprung, and he had walked right into it. His expression shifted from arrogance to sheer, panicked fury. He took a step back, toward the door. Alistair moved. He didn't go for Fenton. He stepped to the fireplace and picked up the iron poker. It wasn't to strike. In one smooth, decisive motion, he turned and slid its hooked end through the door's handle, then wedged it against the stone doorframe, barring the exit. The metallic scrape was the only sound in the suddenly still room. He turned back. He stood shoulder to shoulder with Eleanor, facing the two men who had tried to break them separately. He met his wife's eyes. In them, he saw no fear, no hesitation. He saw the same clear, focused resolve that had been there in the Vance morning room, but now it was turned outward, a shared force. He gave her a single, firm nod. The confrontation wasn't over with shouts or blows. It was over with that nod, and with the unshakable solidarity it represented. The two conspirators were trapped, not just in a cottage, but by the truth, and by a partnership they had never seen coming. The quiet Duke and the ruined debutante were gone. In their place stood the Duke and Duchess of Amberley, ready to reclaim what was theirs. Sometimes, the moment you've been dreading becomes the moment you find your strength. And you find that strength isn't about being the loudest in the room. It's about standing firm, side by side with the right person, and knowing, without a single doubt, that you are no longer alone. The real fight was just beginning, but for the first time, they faced it not as individuals surviving a storm, but as a team built to weather it. And that changes everything. The late August sun was a warm, forgiving gold, pouring over the stone terrace of Amberley Hall. It was the kind of light that made the ancient grey stones look soft and honey-colored, and it caught the edges of the new climbing roses, their deep red blooms almost glowing against the wall. The air smelled of cut grass, sun-baked stone, and the faint, sweet hint of apples from the orchard beyond the garden wall. Alistair Thorne, Duke of Amberley, stood by the terrace wall, a simple, sturdy porcelain cup of tea in his hand. The cup was plain white, with a solid blue band around the rim. No forget-me-nots. It was from a new set, bought in the village, and it felt good in his grasp, honest and unbreakable. He took a slow sip, the tea just the right temperature, and let his gaze travel over the land that rolled out before him like a living quilt. He could see the slate roofs of the tenant cottages in the near distance, most of them new or freshly repaired, their surfaces shining in the sun like still water. The skeleton of the great barn was long gone, replaced by a sturdy new structure, its timber still a pale, raw yellow against the green fields. A crew of men was working on the new stone bridge over the River Amber, their voices and the clink of tools carrying on the quiet breeze as a gentle melody of progress. The chipped blue door of the old steward's cottage was just visible at the edge of the home farm. It was no longer a place of secrets and betrayal. A young, earnest new steward from a neighboring county lived there now with his growing family. The door had been repainted the same blue, but the chip had been filled. It was just a door again. From inside the open French doors of the study, Alistair could hear the clean, efficient sound of a pen scratching on paper. The scent that drifted out was no longer one of dust and decay, but of lemon verbena from the fresh-cut herbs in a vase, and the clean, crisp smell of new ledger books. Eleanor sat at the large oak desk, her head bent over an account. A shaft of sunlight lit the chestnut highlights in her dark hair, which was pinned up simply, a few loose curls escaping at the nape of her neck. She was wearing a dress of soft green muslin, practical for a morning of work. Her brow was furrowed in concentration as she pointed to a column of numbers, speaking to their new steward, Mr. Cobb, who stood respectfully beside her. The timber for the last 3 cottages came in under the estimate, she was saying, her voice clear and confident. We should allocate the difference to the schoolroom fund. Mrs. Evans says the children need new slates. Alistair watched her. He didn't watch her from across a crowded, hostile ballroom. He watched her from a few feet away, a feeling of quiet certainty resting in his chest like a smoothed stone. Her smile as she looked up at Mr. Cobb was true. It wasn't the brittle, polished shield of the season. It was a smile of accomplishment, of building something. It could still be fierce, especially when negotiating with a stubborn supplier, but it was never false. Time was marked differently now. It wasn't measured by the tense tick of a ballroom clock or the desperate passing of social seasons. It was measured by the fading of scandal-ridden broadsheets. They had been used to light the kitchen stove months ago. It was in the steady progress of the bridge's arches rising over the river, paid for with funds recovered from the labyrinth of false companies Burton and Fenton had created. It was in the healing of trust, slow and careful, with the tenants who now saw their Duke and Duchess walking the fields together, asking real questions, and acting on the answers. The legal matters had been settled with a quiet, ruthless efficiency that had surprised London. Confronted with the evidence in the cottage and the threat of total social and financial ruin, Lord Fenton had chosen to retire to the Continent. Mr. Burton, in exchange for a full confession that protected the estate from further scandal, was allowed to resign and move to a distant county. The recovered money wasn't everything that had been taken, but it was enough. Enough to begin again. A footman stepped onto the terrace, a silver tray in his hands. On it lay a single letter. The paper was thick, expensive, and the seal pressed into the red wax was unmistakable, the Fenton crest. "For you, your grace," the footman said, offering the tray to Alistair. Alistair looked at the letter. He felt no anger, no quickening of his pulse. It was just a piece of paper. He picked it up. The wax cracked crisply under his thumb. He didn't open it. He turned and walked the few steps into the study. Eleanor looked up as he entered. Her eyes went from his face to the letter in his hand. She recognized the seal immediately. Her pen stilled. Mr. Cobb, sensing the shift, murmured something about checking the orchard and slipped from the room. Alistair walked to the desk. He didn't read the letter aloud. He simply placed it, unopened, on the smooth, worn wood between them. He then reached out and laid his hand over it, his tanned, work-roughened fingers covering the broken crest completely. Eleanor looked at his hand, then up into his eyes. A silent conversation passed between them, as clear as if they had spoken. We do not need to hear his excuses. His words have no power here anymore. After a moment, a slow, deep breath escaped her, and the slight tension in her shoulders melted away. She gave a small, definitive nod. Then, she turned her gaze from the letter, back out through the terrace doors, to the bright, living land beyond. Alistair removed his hand, leaving the letter where it lay, a forgotten relic. He picked up his cup of tea again. The warmth seeped into his palm. The cup did not rattle. Not even a little. He moved to stand beside her chair, following her gaze. Together, in a comfortable silence that was full, not empty, they looked out at their world. The sound of the river, the calls of the workers at the bridge, the distant laugh of a child from the village path, it all wove together into the sound of a future being built, day by day, stone by stone. Their marriage, that scar of necessity carved in a rainy London morning room, had healed. But it hadn't faded. It had transformed into something stronger than unscarred skin ever could be, a flexible, protective layer of shared history, hard-won trust, and a quiet, abiding respect. No grand lessons were spoken on that sunny terrace. No one said the words, love, or happy ending. They didn't need to. The weight of the change was in the peace of the moment. It was in the shared glance over an unopened letter. It was in the simple, sturdy cup held in a steady hand. They had entered into an agreement to save a estate and a reputation. They had ended up saving each other, not from ruin, but from loneliness. And they had built something new in the process, a partnership, a home, a life. It just goes to show that the most beautiful stories aren't about people who are never broken. They're about people who find the right person to help them pick up the pieces, and in the putting back together, they create a mosaic far more interesting and strong than the original picture ever was. And that is always a story worth telling.